No problem. All right, good evening, everyone. Nice to be together. Okay, we are here. This is Valley Best Shalom, College of Jewish Studies. This is our first in-person session in 3 years. Isn't that amazing? COVID has destroyed Jewish education everywhere, but we're trying to bring it back to life. So thanks for coming this evening. Thanks for being together. You okay? This is VBS College of Jewish Studies. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and our motto is Valley Best Shalom, College of Jewish Studies offers university-level learning, no quizzes, no term papers, no sororities, no football team. Otherwise, an opportunity to learn at the highest level. We want to thank Lil and Jess Beim, just because they're them. How's that? Is that okay? Besides, they're the ones who endowed this program, made it all possible. So thank you so very, very much for your kindness and your continued support. And to everyone who's coming tonight, you should all know, not only is tonight the third year since we've been together, which is really kind of special. Tonight, of course, is the anniversary of Kristallnacht. Tonight, which is 1938, 37, 38, right. And that was the night that the Nazis announced to the world their program to destroy the Jewish people and to destroy Jewish faith and culture. Went rampaging through cities all over Eastern Europe, Germany and Eastern Austria, and destroyed synagogues and stores and rounded up people and began to destroy the Jewish people. And I think the very best response, we can light candles and sing dirges and say prayers, but the very best response is to do this, to gather together and to learn, and to keep Jewish life alive through learning. So thank you for coming tonight. Let's say 2 brachot over learning. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. Good evening. Hi, welcome. Welcome, good to see you. You can pull chairs around. You can sit here in front. You can make yourself, I'm sitting here because there's no sense in standing at a rostrum after a long, hard day. And it's really nice to be together. Okay? Just a program note. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend 4 weeks learning the philosophy of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And tonight I'll tell you everything you want to know about him. And then, well, let me put it this way. In Jewish tradition, when someone lives a life of greatness and that person leaves the world, we do not celebrate that life on the birthday of the person. We celebrate it on the anniversary of their death. Because logically, on the day that person was born, they weren't yet anybody except a screaming baby. It's on the anniversary of the death that you really understand who this soul was. So this year marks the 50th yahrzeit, the 50th anniversary of the passing of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And all over the world, there are going to be commemorations of his life, there are going to be celebrations of his vision, and there are going to be studies of his work, and we're part of that. What we're going to do together is we're going to be learning together these Wednesday nights. Tonight is the 9th, the 16th. We'll skip the 23rd because that's Erev Yontif, and you'll all be home baking turkeys. We'll come back on the 30th and on the 7th of December, those 4 sessions. And then we will conclude this conversation on Sunday night, the 11th of December. Let me tell you what it is. So here's a shorter story. Phil Barron, who's one of the cantors here at VBS, for many years was a composer and worked for the Disney company. He composed 400 songs for Disney. He has a large community of friends who compose music for Hollywood, for movies, for television, for the stage, and for various other kinds of compositions. And 20 years ago, he got them all together. Most of them are Jews, but they've never done anything Jewish as composers. And he started working with them, and called it the Helfman Institute, after the great Jewish composer Max Helfman. And over the years, they've put on many interesting programs. 2 years ago, Phil and the Helfman Institute composers met with me, and we began studying Heschel together. They also met with Dr. Heschel's daughter, Professor Susanna Heschel, and met with her by Zoom. And they have produced a musical presentation based on Heschel's writing. It's a cantata made up of 14 pieces, and they're going to be presenting it at UCLA on the evening of December 11th. So if you're free that night, we'll all go together, we'll all sit together, we'll all share this wonderful presentation, and if you take these next few sessions together, we'll be able to really understand what it is that they created. Then we'll take a hiatus of the Christmas vacation, and we'll come back in January. And 4 Wednesdays in January, my colleague, Rabbi Nolan Leibowitz, will present 4 lectures on the great European-Israeli Rabbi Rav Kook, who is one of the great chief rabbis of Israel, one of the great Jewish mystics of the 20th century. So 2 poets, 2 mystics, 2 philosophers, 2 for the price of 1. Thank you for coming and joining us today, okay? That's the program notes. So 4 Wednesday nights, 7 o'clock. If you don't finish the cookies, they will make a reprise each week until you finish them, because we're that kind of people. Abraham Joshua Heschel, 50 years since his life, and he is today the most influential Jewish philosopher in the world. He's quoted more often, cited more often, just used as a justification more often than any other Jewish philosopher living or gone. The remarkable, influential thinker. And yet, at the same time, in his lifetime, that wasn't the case. In his lifetime, he was a rather lonely person, and upon his death, the Jewish community simply didn't get him. The only people who did a whole issue of a magazine in memory of him upon his passing in 1972 was a magazine called America, which is published by the Jesuit Society. Only in the last 50 years, since he's gone, has the Jewish community changed and its attitudes toward religious life changed in such a way that he has now become so very, very important. So what we're going to do is to try to figure out what makes him so very, very important, what he had to say, and how valuable what he had to say was. I want to make a recommendation to you. Can you put this slide up on the screen? This is called God in Search of Man. This is his magnum opus. It's called he calls it, the subtitle is A Philosophy of Judaism. This is a terrific, powerful book. Very, very deep and dense book, okay? It was originally published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and then the copyright ran out. So now you can get it on Amazon for about $6 or $8. So I'm going to Xerox pages like I did tonight, but it would be really helpful you to go buy this book. Easily obtainable on Amazon. You can get it as a used copy if you want. And you'll enjoy having this book because you'll enjoy being able to go back and read the context of the statements that we're going to be reading together, okay? The problem with this book is it's a really hard book to read. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to meet Heschel, understand who he is, and I'm going to teach you how to read Heschel. Next week, we will dive right into this and really try to understand what it is that his philosophy is all about. I never met Heschel personally. I did, however, meet his wife and his daughter. They came to visit me in Dallas when I was there. And Susie Heschel, Professor Susanna Heschel, was teaching there. She was the first Jewish studies professor at Southern Methodist University, which is a few blocks from where the synagogue where I worked in Texas. And she was hired to teach there. She and her mom came to visit to find her an apartment. The secretary buzzed me one afternoon and said, "There's a Mrs. Heschel here in the office." I said, "Hannah, I'm very tired. I have a very long day. Don't mess with me." She said, no, this really is a Mrs. Heschel in the office. So I came out, and my God, there was Sylvia Heschel and Susanna were there. And we helped Susie find an apartment. And because we were like the only Shomer Shabbos kosher family she knew in town, she spent a lot of Shabboses in our home. And we got to know her very, very well. Today, she is a professor of religion at Dartmouth University. She's married and has 2 beautiful children, lives in North Boston, and is just a very, very special soul. We may have an opportunity during the course of our conversations to have a short conversation with her over Zoom, because I told her I'm teaching her, and she said, "Oh, good, call me up, we'll do something." So we may have a chance to meet her. I never met Heschel himself. Here's how I met Heschel. I was a 17-year-old freshman in college at UC Santa Cruz. I had very long hair and very strange ideas. And every Friday afternoon, I'd call my mom to wish my mom and dad good Shabbos from the dorm room, the dorm hallway phone. And one Shabbos, a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving, I'm talking to Mom, and she says, look, when you get home, the rabbi would like you to come and lead a service for college kids returning home. And I said, you know, Mom, I'm so past that. I really can't do that. You know, Mom, I love the shul and I love you, but the services in this synagogue are, not this synagogue, it was a different synagogue. The services were so dull. And so we were one of those synagogues that made the world safe for responsive readings, you know. It was just, so I said, tell the rabbi I love him, but I'm really not interested. She said, okay, he'll be disappointed, but okay. Next week, Mom calls and says, the rabbi would like to see you when you get home. Oh, shoot, you know, I'm in trouble. So I call him up. I got home for Thanksgiving. I call him up. He says, come over to the house. We'll talk. I went over to his house. He was very kind. He said, what's the problem? I said, Rabbi, I love you. I love this shul. I love the Jewish people. I love Torah. I can't stand the services in our shul. They're just so dull. And it's just, you know, by this time, this is 1971. Every male, I was a year young in school because I'd skipped some grades in elementary school, but all of my classmates were waiting to get their draft numbers to Vietnam. This was when feminism was starting. The whole class of women were growing their hair out and taking off their brassieres. I mean, the world was going crazy in 1971, and my shul was still reading responsive readings. And I said to the rabbi, I can't do this. I love you, but he said, okay. He didn't get mad. He said, okay. He said, do me a favor. He said, turn around. On the end of that shelf, there's an orange book. Pull it out. So I pulled his book out of the shelf. He said, open to the first page and read me the first paragraph out loud. I said, okay. So this is what I read. It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid. I said, hey, he's been to our shul, you know. When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than the voice of compassion, this message becomes meaningless. Religion is the answer to our ultimate questions. The moment we become oblivious to ultimate question, religion becomes irrelevant. He said, that's Abraham Joshua Heschel. I want you to take that book home and read it very carefully. I think you'll find in him a kindred soul. And I've been reading Heschel ever since. Ever since. Look at what he says in this book. This is 1964. He says, religion was not disproved. It's not that science came and displaced religion, displaced faith. It's not that philosophy, secular philosophy, skepticism, atheism came and displaced religion. Religion fell apart in the 1950s and 1960s because it stopped doing what religion is supposed to do. Religion is supposed to help us ask ultimate questions and then help us find the answers to those questions. And what happened in the 1950s and 1960s is that religion became so institutionalized and so convinced that its purpose was to perpetuate these institutions, to do things the way we always did them, and never to upset anybody, and never to challenge anybody, and never to disturb anybody. Religion forgot what it was supposed to do. And that's why people stopped coming to shul. That's why I stopped coming to shul as a kid. Because here was a war in Vietnam that was of questionable value and morality. And literally, I had friends dying. And here were women trying to figure out how to undo 10,000 years of male privilege and chauvinism, and trying to undo the culture the way it had been lived. And here was the nascent, we called it ecology in those days, environmental movement. And here was a ferocious civil rights movement. All of these things, the whole world was being turned inside out, and synagogues didn't reflect any of that. Didn't have any, there was no resonance of the world we lived in the shul that you lived in. And at the same time, people were feeling a profound sense of meaninglessness in their lives And shul had nothing to say with that either. Shul, church. And so for our generation, this became an anthem. And this man who recognized that said, I have to fix that. I have to try a way to fix religion, because it's not that society has undone religion, it's that religion has undone religion. So how do you fix it? So who is this man, Abraham Joshua Heschel? Abraham Joshua Heschel, born 1907 in Warsaw. He is the child of great Hasidic rabbis, born and bred in the thick Hasidic community of Poland. His father's side, 7 generations from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. His mother's side, 6 generations from the Maggid of Mezerich. In French, you say Taka Yichis. I mean, this guy has a heredity. Even as a kid, he was already recognized as a genius. If you ever read Chaim Potak's book, The Chosen, the character of Donnie Saunders, the child of the Rebbe, was Heschel, because Chaim Potak was a student of Abraham Joshua Heschel. He was trained to be a Rebbe. He was a genius. He memorized the Talmud by the time he was 8 or 9 years old. What happened is that by the time he was a teenager, nobody could teach him in the community except his father. His father was the only one smart enough to be his teacher. His father died when he was 16. And his uncle, who was a Rebbe, and his mother, the uncle is the mother's brother, took over the education of this young man. And they realized he's too big a mind for this community. What he was doing, like Donnie Saunders, remember The Chosen, the book The Chosen? And Reuven Malter finds him in the library. Rabbi Malter finds him in the library. Heschel was sneaking out of the yeshiva at night, going down to the end of the block where there was a coffee house, and they had poetry nights, and he was reciting poetry. Now, we'll look at some of the poetry in the next couple of weeks. The poetry can either be read as profoundly religious, or it can be read as a 16-year-old boy who's never touched a girl in his life, thinking about what this other side of the human species is all about. It's kind of religiously erotic in that way. And his mother and his uncle realized, we got to get him out of here. This ain't good for him. So they send him to Vilna to go to a secular Jewish high school. And there's pictures from there. He has no payas, no beard, wears a little cap. And for the first time, he meets European culture. Again, he's the kind of soul that can absorb knowledge. And so he learns languages. He already knows Hebrew, Yiddish, and Aramaic, Polish, and a little bit of German. He learns German, because that's the language of culture. He learns Russian, because he's there. He speaks Polish already. He learns Greek. He learns Latin. He learns French. I hate people like this, don't you? Because I can barely get a thought out in English. He starts learning literature. He starts hearing music for the first time. Imagine, he never heard classical music. All he heard was nigunim, davening, Art. He learns art. He learns science. And he just absorbs it all. And he graduates at age 19, and he decides not to go back and be the Rebbe of the community. Makes a radical choice, goes to Berlin. Berlin was the center of European culture. And he enrolls in the Humboldt University, which is the principal university. This is going to be he was born 1907, 19 years old, 1927. Okay? So he's 28. So what's interesting is his biography and his experience is shared by a whole class of thinkers. There is a story that nobody can verify, but it's not untrue. It can't be untrue. That he lived in the same apartment building with Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, who's going to become the chief rabbi of Yeshiva University and the leader of modern orthodoxy in the 20th century, and Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who's going to become the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe. Because Soloveitchik, Schneerson, Heschel, Buber, Berkowitz, and a bunch of other guys they all share the same biography. They came from the thick religious life of Eastern Europe, studied philosophy and modernity and culture in Berlin, got rescued from Europe or survived the Holocaust, came to America and England and Israel, and tried to help us understand who we are in the world. Heschel's this Hasidic kid in secular Berlin, just absorbing all of this, but it was astonishing to him, just astonishing to him. I gave a lecture once. I talked about Heschel. At your daughter's shul, Temple Israel of Hollywood, has an annual lecture in memory of Rabbi Nussbaum, of blessed memory, is the great rabbi. And I gave the Nussbaum lecture on Heschel. After the lecture, Mrs. Nussbaum is sitting there. I didn't know she was there. She comes up to me, she says, you know, Rabbi, I knew Dr. Heschel when he was in Berlin. I said, oh my God, really? She said, quite the ladies' man. Apparently, again, he's a young man, healthy young man, unmarried. What do you expect, right? So what happens is, he finishes his studies, writes his doctorate on the you have the picture? Yeah, that picture. That's a great picture of him. That's 1940. He finishes his doctorate on the prophets. In German universities, in order to get a PhD, you have to publish. By the 1930s, the Nazis had so controlled Germany that he couldn't publish his dissertation in Germany. But because he was still a Polish citizen, he could get it published by the Polish Academy of Sciences. So he goes back to Warsaw, translates the document into Polish, submits it for publication. It gets accepted for publication. He receives his doctorate. This is now summer 1939. Summer 1939. He begs his family to leave. They have an uncle living in London. They could have gotten out. He begged them to leave. But the problem was his uncle was the head of a Hasidic community. He couldn't leave his community. His mother was the uncle's sister. The mother wouldn't leave her brother. Heschel's sisters wouldn't leave their mom. And so 6 weeks before the war, midsummer 1939, he says goodbye to his family and never sees them again. They are all destroyed in Auschwitz, all murdered in Auschwitz, and the whole community was wiped out. He goes to London, spends 6 months in London teaching and learning, and then there is the American State Department, anti-Semitic as they might have been if you watch Ken Burns' program, the American State Department had a program to rescue European scholars. Hebrew Union College, the Reform Seminary in Cincinnati, had a certain number of visas, and they invited Heschel to come to Cincinnati. Heschel, and that's what he looked like in 1939, 1940, when he comes to Cincinnati, Ohio. He is completely fish out of water, which is going to be a theme of his whole life. First of all, he doesn't speak English yet. He speaks every other language in the world, but he's learning English. So he has a hard time communicating. Second of all, he is a deeply mystical, religious, Hasidic fellow in a very German Reform seminary. And they didn't understand him. They made him teach Introduction to Hebrew, which is like asking Einstein to teach Introduction to Arithmetic. I mean, you understand, it was the only thing they can imagine him teaching. He can't eat in the commissary because it's not kosher. All he can have are boiled eggs because it's not, but he attracts a certain group of students who, many of whom were raised in Yiddish-speaking homes and could communicate with him, and began to realize who he was and what he had, what he could teach them. There is a chilling scene in his biography. He has a 2-volume biography written by Professor Edward Kaplan of University of Washington. Kaplan writes this chilling scene in about 1943 when they get a message, when HUC, the seminary, gets a message from the Joint Distribution Committee, which is the American Jewish community's representatives in Europe, confirming that Heschel's family's been killed. And the president of the college and 3 of his friends, students that he was working with, who spoke enough Yiddish to communicate with him, they go to him in his dorm room. He's living in the dormitory at HUC, the student dorm. And they tell him to sit down. They have news to share with him. That his mother, that his sisters, that his uncle, that except for just a few relatives, he has an uncle in London and he had an uncle in Brooklyn. Otherwise, they're all gone. The Nazis had killed all of them. And now he is truly a man of profound loneliness. He's lonely because there's nobody who knows him. Nobody who understands where it came from. He's lonely because his religious life is so out of sync with the America that he finds himself. He's lonely because he doesn't speak the language in every sense of the word. He doesn't speak the language of this culture. In 1945, he is invited to come to the Jewish Theological Seminary, my alma mater. JTS was more traditional than HUC. He could eat in the cafeteria and daven in the shul. But he's still a fish out of water, because Hasidism, at that moment in American Jewish history, was considered superstitious, backward, atavistic. I mean, the great Professor Lieberman, who was the professor of Talmud, who ran JTS at the time, he once invited the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, Gershon Scholem, to teach at the seminary, give some lectures. And the students ran to him and they said, Lieberman, what do you mean mysticism? It's nonsense. It's superstition. It's undignified. He said, boys, you'll understand this if you speak a little Yiddish. Narishkeit is narishkeit. Foolishness is foolishness. But the study of narishkeit is science. You know, Heschel was not given an appointment as a professor of philosophy, which is what he asked for, what his doctorate was in. Heschel was not given an appointment as a professor of Talmud or a professor. He was given a strange title. He's a professor of Jewish ethics and mysticism. Mysticism, what they meant by mysticism was something pejorative. Something, it was ugly, it was irrational, it was foolishness, it was worthless. And that's how he was treated there. He was treated as a person. And he on top of that, he was a dreadful classroom teacher. Everyone who took him, all he did was read from his books. But what he did do was he would pick out a student or two who sort of resonated with him, and they would become his disciples. And they would walk him home on Shabbos morning from the seminary synagogue to his apartment on Riverside Drive. Or he would learn with them individually. Schulweis told me this story. So Schulweis was an acolyte of Professor Mordechai Kaplan, who was the other great scholar of the seminary, whose religious philosophy is diametrically opposite to Heschel's. And Schulweis takes him because Schulweis is a philosophy major, and Heschel teaches a class in medieval philosophy. And he says, here's what happened. So Schulweis told me this story, Rabbi Schulweis. He said, he sends us a message saying, don't come to class Thursday, meet me at my house on Shabbos afternoon. So 5 or 6 of the boys, the seminary students, they walk over to his house on Riverside Drive, and he welcomes them, and there's tea and cake, and he sits down, and they all think we're going to learn Rambam, we're going to learn Maimonides, we're going to learn Sadia Gaon, we're going to learn Yehuda Halevi. No, he starts singing a nigun, and they're like looking at each other like, where's the text? Where's the learning? He and Schulweis didn't get along because Schulweis realized he didn't want students, he wanted disciples. And Schulweis was too, farbrent, he was too much into questioning to be a disciple of a Rebbe like this. But he would choose a few students each year, and those students became his sort of voice in the community. And now, as soon as he learned English and really became proficient in English, he started writing, and he writes 3 different kinds of things. He writes a philosophy of Judaism, and we'll look at that. That's what we're going to spend our time on, which is trying to help those of us who grow up in a secular, scientifically minded culture to understand the value of religion, and Judaism in particular. He writes monographs on Jewish scholarly issues, some incredible stuff on the prophets, on the rabbis, on Hasidic tradition, and he becomes a social activist. In his later years, he becomes a very powerful social activist. We'll talk about that in a second. And he writes a lot of lectures and speeches and essays that reflect his social activism. Let's come back now, and I want to answer 3 questions. I want to ask 3 questions. What kind of Jew is he? What kind of philosopher is he? And how do you read him? Okay? What kind of Jew, what kind of philosopher, and how do you read him? All right, let's start with number 1. What kind of Jew is Abraham Joshua Heschel? He is a Chassid. Now, when you and I think of Chassid, we think of these fellows with the long black coats, and if you've ever been in New York or Jerusalem, the fuzzy hats, and the guys who will throw tefillin on you at the mall if you're not looking, that's not Hasidism. That's really not Hasidism. Let me tell you what Hasidism really is. I'm going to go back to 1492. 1492, Isabel marries Ferdinand, and as a wedding present, they throw all the Jews out of Spain and steal all their property. This was a devastating event because Jews had been in Spain for 800 years to that day, or more, and had created one of the great Jewish civilizations of all of Jewish history. And for it to end so abruptly and so cruelly. So Jewish refugees from Spain went all over Europe, mostly to Holland and Italy, Northern Africa, and a large number, particularly the scholars, ended up in the northern Israeli city of Tzfat, S-A-F-E-D, Safed or Tzfat. It's a beautiful little town. And they formed there a cell, a community of mystics, philosophers, and scholars. And they had to figure out the simple question of their own existence. If God is good, and God is loving, and God is perfect, why is the world so broken, and why are we in exile? And there came along a young scholar by the name of Isaac Luria, who himself was a deeply, deeply powerful mystic, who lived in that community for only 3 years. He was 36 when he got there and 38 when he died. Never wrote anything down, and completely revolutionized the world of Jewish thought, of Jewish philosophy and mysticism. Sort of the Mozart of the Jewish tradition. Young guy, lives a few years and blows everyone out of the water. Luria said, here's how the world came to be. In the beginning, God was all. Infinite God fills every place. God decides, somehow, to create a world. In order to create a world, God needs to create a zone of not God in which to create the world. So God withdraws from a space inside of God and creates our universe. That withdrawal is called tzimtzum. Into that space, God creates some structures and then breathes light and life and energy into the structures. God breathed too much light into the structures shattered and broke. We live in that world, the world of broken pieces. Then God creates human beings and gives human beings the task of tikkun olam, fixing the world. We are God's hands to fix God's world. That was Lurianic Kabbalah in about 30 seconds. Got it? 1538. In the 17th century, 150 years later, the third worst century for the Jewish people ever. 20th century was the worst. The first century was the second worst. Why? Because the beginning of the 1600s, there is a massive nationalist movement in Ukraine, ironically enough, sweeps across Russia and Eastern Europe, the Chmelnytsky massacres, destroying Jewish communities. Murder, rape, pillaging, horrible pogroms, horrible. Jewish community suffers terribly. Then comes a false messiah by the name of Shabtai Tzvi. Comes from Turkey, goes to Israel, announces himself the Messiah. The whole Jewish world says, oh my God, this is God's mercy after the destructions of the massacres. The Messiah has come. People literally sold all their belongings, getting ready to follow him to Israel. He leads a march, comes to the Turkish border. The Sultan's police arrest him. The Sultan interrogates him. They offer him a choice, convert to Islam or die. He converts to Islam. That movement collapses. And there is such a sense of disillusionment and despair and sadness in the Jewish world. And then the rabbis of Eastern Europe diagnose this and decide, and they make the worst diagnosis of any Jewish doctor ever. They decide the problem was too much enthusiasm. So they create what's called the yeshiva culture. They build the great yeshivas of Eastern Europe, and they create a philosophy which says only the most learned and most pious can come to God. Only the most pious have their prayers answered by God. The rest of us schleppers, our job is to support a yeshiva student, and he'll pray for us, and he'll do mitzvahs for us. We schleppers can't get anywhere near God. And so the answer, they thought that was going to solve the problem, but you can imagine that what happened was, it just made people even more depressed. Because what are you telling them? You'll never get close to God. You can pray all you want, God doesn't hear your prayers. Why? You're not frum enough. You're not orthodox enough, not orthodox with an O enough. You're not observant enough. The Jewish people at the end of the 1600s, end of the 17th century, are so depressed. It's like this wave of sadness, depression, and despondency comes across Europe. And out of that comes a revolution. And that revolution is called Hasidism. There's a preacher, not even a rabbi, he's a preacher. He's a storyteller. He's a maggid, he's a magic worker. And what he does is he creates amulets. In those days, you didn't have penicillin or COVID shots. You got sick, I gave you an amulet with God's name in it. He was one of the best amulet creators in the country, and so they called him the Baal Shem Tov, the guy who knew God's name. Because if he gave you an amulet, you didn't get sick. If he gave an amulet, your wife got pregnant. If he gave him an amulet, I mean, he could create miracles using using God's name. And he preaches a new philosophy. And here's the philosophy. Remember Luria's idea of how the world got created? In the beginning, it was all God, and then God withdrew and created a universe. Said the Baal Shem Tov, God never withdrew. Tzimtzum never happened. And therefore, it's all God. The whole world is God. God is everywhere. You can bump into God anytime, any place, in any circumstance, under any conditions, you're bumping into God. The only reason you think you can't get close to God is not because God is far away, it's because you're so damn depressed. Our alienation from the divine is a psychological condition, not a metaphysical condition. If I can get you out of your depression, if you can be a little happy for a few minutes, you'll come to realize that God is in all things, at all moments, that God hears all of our prayers, that God is waiting for us to join Him, to join God. He quotes a verse from the Zohar, the great tradition of Jewish mysticism, Leit atar panui mine. No place in the world is free of God. Which means, you want to come to shul and daven? Gesundheit, come to shul and daven. You want to go out to the forest and commune with the animals? That's as good a place to commune with God as shul. You want to be a yeshiva student and learn the holy books? Good. You want to do accounting and learn and talk to God? Good. God will talk to you there. God can talk to you anywhere. You can talk to God anywhere. Anybody can talk to God. In fact, the less educated you are, the better you are at talking to God. Because all you smart rabbis, you think you know everything. You get so wrapped up in your egos, that gets in the way of God. It's better you'd be a plain, ordinary peasant. Hasidism was a religious movement that was a rebellion against orthodoxy. It was a popular movement rebelling against rabbis. And it said all of us can come close to God. Doing anything, as long as you do it with the right kavanah. So I'll give you a story. This is a wonderful story, right? A Litvak, one of my ancestors, a religiously pedantic Jew, is talking to a Hasid, a mystic. And he says, the problem with you Hasidim is you don't observe the law. You don't observe the halacha. There is a time to pray the morning prayers. There's a time to pray the evening prayers. And you Hasidim, you ignore those rules. And the Hasid says, oh, my brother, you're absolutely right. Let me tell you what happens. I wake up in the morning, I take my talis and my tefillin and my siddur, I go to the window to pray, I open the window, you know what happens? The morning floods into my room. The sun is rising, the air is crisp, I see children on their way to school, I see grown-ups on their way to work, I see the sun rising over the horizon. I'm so taken with the music of the morning, I forget to pray. Comes evening, I will pray on time. I'm determined. I take my siddur, I go to the window, I open the window. You know what happens? The night is falling. The sky is getting dark. The stars are coming out. Families are gathered around their hearths and their homes. There is such a quiet on the landscape. I am so taken with the nighttime, I forget to pray. He says, but tomorrow I have a solution. Tomorrow I'll close the window. And the Litvak says, God forbid. Now think about that story a minute. What is he saying? He's saying that the essence of religion is not the form, not the ritual, the thing we do. the essence of the religion is an experience. And if you have the experience, the form is only secondary to the experience. The form is a vessel for the experience. But sometimes the form, we become so obsessed with the form, we let the form drown out the experience. And that's the brokenness of religion. Does that sound familiar? Religion wasn't refuted. Religion declined because of its own defeats. That's Heschel, you see? So what he needs to do is to help us understand how we can return to that repertoire of experience. And in this, he's going to say something very important to us. He used to begin his lectures the same way. This little man with a beard and funny hair. We'll look at him in a minute because there's some videotape. And he would whisper into the microphone, "Ladies and gentlemen, a great miracle just happened. The sun went down." People would look at him like he's a lunatic. And then he'd start to talk about that. And he'd say, the fact that the sun went down and not one of us went to the window to look tells you a lot about us. Tells you what we've lost as human beings. We've lost that sensibility to those experiences. And that is a loss of an element of our humanity. And the loss of that element of our humanity is frightening, because that's the reason for so much of the brokenness of the world around us. If you're not taken with a sunset, then you use the world as a tool. You don't see the world as something of ultimate value to protect and appreciate. And that becomes part of our ethical dilemma of modernity. So that's the kind of Jew he is. Everybody got that so far? Okay, what kind of philosopher is he? Ready? I'm going to teach you a word. This is going to make you sound really smart tomorrow morning. The word is phenomenology. Doesn't that sound great? It sounds like a department at Kaiser, but it's not. Phenomenology is a philosophy that says, if you know a little philosophy, it says what we're going to do is we're going to bracket out all of human Kant's questions and just go ahead and know the world as we know it. Here's the answer. There are many ways to know the world. Many ways to know the world. And each way of knowing is appropriate for a certain kind of thing to know. If you want to know how to cure cancer or cure COVID, go ask a biochemist. Go ask an epidemiologist. Go ask a medical scientist. He'll tell you that COVID is caused by a certain virus. A virus is a collection of proteins. A virus can be attacked in this way, and here's how you create a vaccine for COVID. Whatever. Okay, fair enough. Sorry, doctor, sorry. He's a doctor. But if you go to that same biochemist and say, tell me about love, and that biochemist will say, well, it's very simple. Under certain stimuli, certain enzymes start flowing through your body, and certain levels of certain things go out, and you say, what are you talking? Enzymes, hormones, energy. What? I want to know about love. Don't ask a biochemist about love. Ask a poet about love. Ask an artist about love. Don't ask the poet how to cure a disease, because you'll get the wrong answer. Sir, each phenomenon that we encounter in the world has its own particular way of knowing. Science is very valuable for knowing certain things. Science is completely inept when it comes to knowing other things. You need other ways of knowing. And here's Heschel's insight. Religion is a way of knowing the world. So he said it's a way of answering certain questions. Religion is a way of knowing the world. You can't prove anything, religiously. In other words, when you open Heschel, you're not going to see a proof for the existence of God or a proof for the truth of the Bible. Because proving it means I'm using one way of knowing to prove the validity of another way of knowing. You can't scientifically prove why Beethoven's Fifth is a good piece of music. You can't. If you want to know if Beethoven's Fifth or Beethoven's Ninth is a good piece of music, schmuck, listen to it. And if you like it, you know it's a good piece of music. Because scientifically, you can't prove that. On the other hand, no poet can cure a disease. No rabbi can cure a disease. If you come to the rabbi and say, cure the disease, I'm sorry. Someone once came to me and said, I want to buy a red string. You know these red strings that people wear? I said, what? You want to buy a what? She wants, I want to buy a relative of mine is sick. I want to buy a red string to make them better. I said, red string? She said, yeah, there's a rabbi in my neighborhood sells them for $26. How much do you sell them for? I have to confess to you that I was so tempted to say, oh, for me it's 2 for $26. I was so tempted. I was so tempted. Come on, I said, the red strings don't cure diseases. Medicine cures. You want the name of a good doctor? I'll give you that. Now, on the other hand, I said, I can help your loved one have the strength to take the medicine. That I can do. Religion is a way of knowing the world. You can't use any other way to know what religion knows. But if you lose religion, you've lost a way of knowing a certain class of human experiences. You've lost the way to answer a certain set of questions. And those questions happen to be what he calls ultimate questions. Questions like, what's the meaning of my life? What is the purpose of love? How do I treat my fellow person? These are questions that science can't answer for us. But religion is fully equipped to answer them if we know how to know the world through the eyes of religion. But here's the problem. You ready? Religion is a separate way of knowing the world. Therefore, it has its own vocabulary. But if we've lost religion, how do you regain that vocabulary? You don't even have the words to regain it. And that becomes his third episode, his third element. He's going to teach us a new vocabulary. He's going to try to build a bridge between how we already know the world, what we already know, and what we need to know in order to see the world religiously. Because what he's going to do ultimately is not prove anything, but show us what the world looks like through the eyes of a religious person. In the same way that if someone came to you and said, teach me about love, you say, I can't teach you about love. I can just tell you what love does for me. I can tell you how I fell in love. I can tell you how much I love my wife. I can tell you how much I love my kids. And maybe by hanging out with me long enough, you'll understand what love is just by watching the way I love my wife and my kids. And Heschel says the same thing. Hang out with me for a while and I'll show you how a religious person lives. And maybe it'll become contagious. Because that really is the only way to come and learn how to know the world through those eyes. And so the reason why Heschel is so difficult to learn is because he's learning and he's writing in a language that's very hard to approach, because he knows that he can't fully describe what he's talking about. He can only point to it, right? In English, you say, there's a wonderful word in English. The word is elusive. If you write the word with an A, it means to refer to something, alludes to something. If you write the word with an E, it means it's hard, it's obscure. And he's elusive on both levels. He's obscure, and because he's pointing to something that's beyond the words he's using. He's going to make the claim, and this is what we'll do next week, that religion is something we know without being able to conceptualize it. There are things that we know without being able to put them into words. And so the phrase he's going to use over and over again is that each of us possesses a sense of the ineffable. I had to look this up, so don't worry. Ineffable means inexpressible. Can't find the words for it. Now, it's ironic that he writes this 400-page book on the sense of that which you can't describe. But that's exactly what he's trying to do. And he's going to say, look, you all know this. You have grandchildren. Tell me about what it's like to be with your grandchildren. You'll say, it's inexpressible. Right? You have a daughter getting married. Tell me what it's like to see a daughter getting married. It's ineffable. You've raised a daughter and sent her to Berkeley, and every night you worry about her. It's ineffable, right? I mean, it's ineffable. It's inexpressible. We all know of elements of our lives that are terribly important to us that we can't express, and yet we know what those are, and we know how important they are. That's the sensibility. That's where religion begins. That's where religion begins. So what Heschel is going to do for us is give us a sense of that, of how it all begins. Okay? Now, there's one more piece to this I want to point out, then I'll stop. No, I won't. Then I'll stop a little bit. He's trying to teach us to see religion because he wants us to understand that without religion, we are not fully human. We have lost an element of our humanity. In that sense, he's a good religious philosopher. But there's another piece to him. The other piece to him is that he is very much a refugee and, if you will, a survivor of the Holocaust. And the back of his mind, every single day of his life, every moment of his life, is the fact that everybody he loved, everybody he cherished, the world he came from, was brutally destroyed by human beings. And what he's going to say to us is not just that you need to recover that religious way of knowing in order to be fully human. That he's going to say. But there's an implied statement as well, which you'll hear through the lines, which is, what gave human beings the capacity to create Auschwitz? What gave human beings the capacity, what gave white people the capacity to destroy African American black people in the American South? What gave America the impetus to do horrifying things to the Vietnamese? He was very much against that one. What creates hate in this world? The same problem that separates us from the religious way of knowing separates us from the parts of ourselves that keep us from doing evil. In other words, religion is the only thing that can save us. The religious way of knowing the world is the antidote to the brutal, destructive capacity of human beings. And this is something he realizes in his later years. In 1960, he retranslates his dissertation was first in German, then in Polish. Then he translates it into English and publishes it about the biblical prophets. And his thesis, we're going to do this in our third session, his thesis is that the prophets saw the world through God's eyes. And they saw evil as something that just destroyed them internally. And that becomes Heschel. And he becomes a spokesman for a whole wide variety of social causes, which were far beyond the purview of a JTS professor. They thought he was out of his mind. He becomes his best friend in the world was Martin Luther King. And when the first, remember the Selma, there were two Selma marches. The first one, they got beaten down on the bridge. So they came back a few days later and they did the second march. He flies from New York down to Alabama, and there he is. Do the one with the march, that one. King is the one in the middle. I don't know why they're wearing flower lace, but King is the one in the middle, right? Heschel is two people over from him with the guy with the beard. Now you gotta know JTS for a minute. My school, they were so far out of the social milieu, and they were so far away from the civil rights movement. And the Jewish community, we all look at that picture and say, oh, Jews and African Americans were. No, the American Jewish community, especially in the South, didn't want to make trouble. Didn't want to make trouble. And he was a troublemaker. And they couldn't figure out what he was doing. Then, you remember there was a war in a place called Vietnam. I have to explain this to kids because they don't believe me. You know, we had a war in Iraq a few years ago, and we lost 3,000 souls. America, God knows how many Iraqis we killed, right? We lost 53,000 in Vietnam. There were 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam at the height of the war. And some of you remember this. And every one of us who was of that age was absolutely terrible. In fact, you can play a game. Ask any man my age, just say, what was your number? 157. What was your number, Zane? There you go, right. Your fate was in that ping pong ball, right? My roommate was number 7. They figured out, he went to the commissary and figured out, he went to the dispenser, went to the health service sign, so they found something wrong with him, and he got it. Heschel becomes the chairperson of clergy and laity against the war. And the crazy thing was, they kept telling him, like, don't be so strident. Don't be so loud. Be more compromised. We can have remember the idea was, peace with honor. And he was just nuts, because for him, Vietnam was a flashback to Nazi Germany. What happened to King in the South, what happened to African American in the South was a flashback to Nazi Germany, right? He was one of the first to speak out against Jews trapped in the Soviet Union. It's a flashback to Nazi Germany. Because his idea here, and this is where his social activism is directly connected to his religious philosophy, the loss of a sense of the ineffable, which means the loss of our sense of the ultimate preciousness of each human person, and the idea that we can use people the way we use tools, is at the heart of all of these examples of brokenness of the world. And so he becomes a powerful social activist, a powerful social activist. And one of the last things he did, he was 65 years old, had a terrible heart, but Daniel Berrigan, remember him? Catholic priest who was arrested for destroying draft records. Daniel Berrigan was being released from Danbury federal prison in the winter of '72. And Heschel decides he wants to go and see him. And his family said, don't do it, you're not a healthy man. And he said, I don't want Father Berrigan to come out of prison and have to see only the faces of FBI agents. I want him to look into the face of someone who spends his days with the Hebrew Bible. And he goes up to see Berrigan, and a few months later he died. Heschel, this philosophy of recovering religion, because it's the only way to recover our lives in this world, that's the message of his social activism. And it's a message that now resonates even stronger than it did during the time. Let's do one little thing, because I think you'll enjoy this. You all probably know that we have very, very little videotape of Moses Maimonides, because Maimonides was a 12th century philosopher, and Zoom wasn't invented till the 14th century. But shortly before his death, he recorded an interview with Carl Stern, who was the NBC correspondent for the Supreme Court. Stern was a Jewish guy, had never met Heschel, and Heschel gave this interview. And just to see him and hear him, so go to the beginning of the interview. Can you do it? Yeah, the beginning. Just start at the beginning. And let's, can you turn the sound on? Yeah, put the microphone over here. You just got to enjoy this, because it's really remarkable. Can everybody see the screen? Good. You got it?
Yeah, give me 2 seconds.
My son is a genius. Did anybody meet my son? This is my son, by the way. I hired him. It's the last of the mom and pop businesses. This, my wife works here, my kid works here.
We tried to retire, they hired 3 more of us.
That's true, by the way. You got rid of one Feinstein, we spread all over the damn place.
I brought these books from home. They're only a small portion of the books you've written. What was there in your life, especially your early life, that would give you the thoughts to fill so many books?
Hard work, training, and a good environment. I was very fortunate in having lived as a child and as a young boy in an environment where there were many people I could revere, people concerned with problems of inner life, of spirituality, of integrity, people who have shown great compassion and understanding for other people.
But your life itself has not been an easy life. You escaped from Poland just before the Nazis came in. What experiences of life have found their way into these books?
I would say, again, my background, my early upbringing. I would criticize my early upbringing as deficient in one respect and very rich in another respect. Deficient in what is maybe called the art of relaxation, sports. I'm not the sporty type, unfortunately, but very rich in moments of exaltation. This enabled me to stand a little bit above the circumstances of life and to take a perspective from which I could see the world, so to speak, from a higher point of view. In other words, I was trained as a child to live a life, or to strive to live a life which is compatible with the mystery and marvel of human existence.
And learning about it. What is the role of learning?
The role of learning was decisive. First of all, the supreme value ascribed to learning, and learning being a source of inspiration, learning being the greatest adventure, learning being a source of joy, and in fact, learning for the purpose of discovering of the importance of self-discipline, the realization, namely, that a life without discipline was not worth living.
Perhaps a life without surprise is not worth living either. You recently told an interviewer that what keeps me alive is my ability to be surprised. What has surprised you lately?
Everything. This may be my weakness. You know, you quoted once a statement from the book of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun, and I disagree with that statement. I would say there's nothing stale under the sun, except human beings who become stale. I try not to be stale, and everything is new. No two moments are alike, and a person who thinks the two moments are alike has never lived. The secret of it is a very profound principle in philosophy, and that I would call the sense for the unique. Do you know that among 1 billion faces in this world, no two faces are alike? The other day, a person complained to me. He went to the Metropolitan Art Museum, and he was bewildered because no two paintings looked alike.
One of the most arresting.
Just to give you a sense of there's a playfulness to this, and there's a lovingness to this, but at the same time, there's an edge to it. And the edge is a man who's survived the worst of the worst and really believes that he holds the key to saving humanity from doing it again. And that's, we're going to put this up on the, we'll send it to you on the next email and put it up on the website. You can download this interview. It's about a 35-minute interview. It's really charming. And again, it's amazing to hear his voice and see his, I don't know where he got that tie from. I got to ask Susie. We got to ask Susie where he got the tie. But just an amazing soul, just an amazing, and there's some other recordings of his lectures. This is the only videotape that I could find. This is the only videotape that I could find. Let's take one more moment, if it's okay. Everybody okay so far? And let's just learn a little bit of his words. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to send you to go learn some more, and we'll continue next week. Next week, what we'll do is I want to take up the question of how do you know that God is real? How do you see the world through the eyes of religion? So it's his knowledge, his epistemology, how he sees the world. The following week, we're going to learn about how he reads the Bible, what he learned from the Bible. And then the fourth week that we do together, we'll talk about his philosophy of sacred deeds, of mitzvah, and of social action. And then we'll go hear Cantor Barron's music, which is quite remarkable. Okay? So take a look with me here. Just put one of the pictures up, if you don't mind. Take a look at the bottom of the page. Okay? This comes from this book, God in Search of Man. It's the first section of the book. And I want to show you how to read him, because you have to read him in a certain way, okay? Heschel never wrote books. Heschel never wrote articles. Heschel wrote lines and paragraphs on index cards. And he would hand a pile of index cards to his student assistant and say, put it together. And the assistant would sort of put it in order and write all the intervening text so that the thing worked out as a chapter. So you'll notice that his book is divided into chapters. They're very short. They're 5 pages long. Each chapter is divided into sections, which are about a page long. Each section is divided into paragraphs. And what you need to do is read one paragraph at a time and stop and think about it. That's how it was. I'll give you just a funny story. I was invited to give a lecture at a conference, and of all things, they wanted me to talk about death and dying. He wrote an article on death and dying, and I knew he wrote an article on death and dying, and I figured if Heschel writes on death and dying, it's worth reading his article. So I have the book it's in, and I read the article, and I didn't understand it. I couldn't figure out, like, from one paragraph to the other, it just didn't work. So I did it again. I read it 10 times. Now, his last student assistant was a rabbi named Baruch Friedman Cole, who at the time was a rabbi of Bethesda congregation in Toronto and was a friend of mine from Hartman. So I called him and I said, Baruch, you know this essay on death? He said, oh, that one. I said, what do you mean, oh, that one? He said, you had trouble reading it, right? I said, yeah, I don't understand it. I can't follow it. He said, yeah. Heschel wrote paragraphs on cards. And then he handed the stack of cards to the student. The guy dropped the cards. He had figured out the order he wrote the article was together, and he was about to type it up for the publisher when he dropped the deck of cards. And they scattered all over the place, and he didn't have time to put it back together, so he just picked them up randomly. It's like shuffling a deck of cards. And that's what he said, here's what you do. Xerox the article, cut up the paragraphs, paste them onto cards, reshuffle them, it'll come out to be a great essay. I said, are you kidding me? He said, no, you want me to send it to you? He said, no, I can do it. So I did it. I Xeroxed the article, put it on cards, reshuffled them. Sure enough, perfectly good essay, right? So the way you read Heschel is like you're reading poetry or you're reading a meditation text. Stop after each paragraph and say, what did he just say? What does he mean? What does he, and he has a wonderful sense of language. So let's read it, then I want to finish together, okay? So here's what he writes. Ready? Wonder, and he translates wonder as radical amazement. Now, regular amazement isn't good enough. Radical amazement. So what is radical amazement? It's like surprise. He talked about the sense of surprise. The oh wow moment. Anyone ever have an oh wow moment? You want to put the text up, yo? You got it? Wonder or radical amazement is the chief characteristic of a religious person's attitude toward history and nature. All right, stop a second. I went to seminary for 7 years. You think I ever heard the word wonder once? Except I wonder whether it's going to snow and I have to teach Hebrew school this evening, right? You know, if I ask anybody, if I ask you, what's the chief characteristic of a religious person's attitude? You'd say faith, belief. You know, if you're of a certain ilk, you'd say observance or affiliation or identity. Heschel says all that's really important, but that's not the essence. What's the essence of religion? The essence of religion is the capacity to walk the world and go, ooh, oh, wow. Remember the story with the chassid in the window? Right? The experience of opening the window in the morning, looking outside and going, oh my God, a new day. Right? Or the experience of opening the window at night and saying, oh, a peaceful night. Wonder is the essence of religion. Now just stop for a second. Forget about everything you know about. Just imagine how Judaism would be different if wonder were the essence of the thing. Right? What would be different? I mean, just think about how we would conduct ourselves, how we would pray, how we would observe, how we would think, if the idea was to create human beings who walked around the world going, ooh, wow, look at that. Right? Look at the next line. Ready? One attitude is alien to his spirit, taking things for granted, regarding events as the natural course of things. What's the opposite of religion? The opposite of religion is not atheism or skepticism or doubt or cynicism. The opposite of religion is boredom. The opposite of religion is a person who says, ho-hum, nothing interesting here. Nothing in the world gathers that person's attention. Walk the world and be bored with it all. Right? So who are the most religious people you know? 3-year-olds. Right? We have a nursery school here in the building. It's saved my life, I have to tell you. Because in my line of work, I get a lot of moments of real difficult despair. And what I tend to do when I'm really having a tough day is I'll go downstairs and there's a classroom. I got a whole bunch of kids. And I'll just, I can walk into a classroom. And 3-year-olds, because everything to them is new. Right? The greatest thing in the world, what's the greatest thing in the world? When a bug crawls in the room. Here's this poor teacher who's been working on lessons and plans and learning centers, and the bug walks in the room. So, half the kids are squeamish and go, ooh, bug! And the other half goes, ooh, look, wow. Right? Like, what could be more cool than a bug? Right? Because a 3-year-old, nothing's old. Everything's new. That's why you ever give a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old a Hanukkah present? What happens? They play with the present for 5 minutes and then they play with the box. Ooh, a box. Wow, it can be a house, it can be a fort, it can be a car, it can be a tank, it can be an airplane, it can be, ooh, right? Turns out Toys R Us sells boxes now. Did you know this? Toys R Us. Because that's true, that you can actually buy gift boxes, and the gift is the box. They don't put a gift in the box. The box is the gift. Because they know that the kid's only going to play with the toy for an hour, right? Or half an hour. And the box is going to be endlessly fascinating, right? Now, who do you have to be in the world to find an empty cardboard box fascinating? So Heschel says that's what religion is all about. And then here's this line, which I love. Remember I told you about the thread of poignancy, the thread of urgency in him? As civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. Such a decline is an alarming symptom of our state of mind. Mankind will not perish for want of information, only for want of appreciation. That's a great line. I mean, so what you do is you just read a paragraph and stop. And just take it in. And just take it in and enjoy it. Because that's how Heschel writes. That's how Heschel writes. All right, I got one more thing I want to do, but I want to stop. Anyone have questions, comments, counter sermons, better ideas, concerns? Yes, please, Sherry. Sorry? Radical amazement? It means everything is amazing, even your capacity to be amazed. He says, a religious person isn't stopped by the fact that there are facts, because he wonders how wonderful it is that there are facts altogether. That even, we'll do this next week, because this is what we're going to do next week, this whole section. But the idea that you know something doesn't mitigate the surprise of it, because the fact that you know it is a surprise. Right? The whole idea that you can know anything. Everything in the world, including the capacity to know everything in the world, is open to this idea of, oh, wow. Right? And that's what that's what radical amazement is. And again, he's using language elusively, with an A, poetically. He wants to push you out of your normal way of thinking. This is a shove, because he knows that what you're going to say is, well, the chief characteristic of a religious person is faith, or belief, or kashrus, observance, okay? And he's trying to say, no, those are important. Don't get me wrong. He lives a very orthodox life with a big O, right? Soloveitchik was another thinker. They were friends. Soloveitchik was uptown. He was in downtown. Soloveitchik has this idea of there are two attitudes corresponding to the two stories of creation. In one of them, which is the scientific attitude, which creates models of the world in order to control the world. And the other one is what he calls an existentialist attitude, which is called Adam 2, which begins with my understanding that I don't understand anything. And so in many ways, you'll find parallels between Heschel, Soloveitchik, Buber, and other philosophers of this ilk, because what they're trying to do is say, modernity has embraced one part of the human mind and forgotten the other. And in forgetting that other part of the human repertoire, we have lost a part of ourselves, the part that's most precious. Buber says, I, it, I, thou. I, it is the mentality of using people and things. I, thou is when I engage with something in its uniqueness simply to appreciate and be intimate, but not to use it. And so Buber, Heschel, Soloveitchik, and others, this kind of duality philosophy, we'll see this frequently in Heschel. In his book, The Sabbath, which we're going to take a look at, he talks about an attitude of revering space and an attitude of revering time. We'll look at these dualities, but that's where he gets that from. Okay, yes. Brian, do you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry. Someone else. Yeah, Bill? Yeah, right. Right. And you're saying it's amazing. I'm alive. I woke up this morning, right? And the older you get, the more you say that with fervence. All right, other questions? Yeah, Scott, please. All right, now Kaplan. This is a great question. Kaplan, who was the other great American Jewish philosopher. First of all, Kaplan and Heschel were very close. They worked opposite. On the 6th floor of the seminary, their offices were opposite each other. Kaplan's philosophy of Judaism and of religion is exactly the opposite. Kaplan says there's one way to know the world. It's the way we all know the world. And anybody who says that there's some radical amazement way of knowing the world is just teaching you irrationality and nonsense. So what would happen is the two of them were very good friends. They lived close to each other. They used to spend Shabbos together. Kaplan's 80th birthday, Heschel is the keynote speaker. Very kind to each other. And Kaplan was rejected by most of the seminary faculty also, but Heschel never did. Heschel respected him. So these two European gentlemen would would walk over from Riverside Drive to JTS together, carefully, speak wonderful word. They both like cigars, so they'd smoke cigars together, ride the elevator up to the 6th floor, go to their respective offices, write vicious things about each other, right? Not vicious things personally, but it was like, each one of them wrote that the other guy was nuts and had the completely wrong idea about how to do Judaism. Come down, eat lunch, very cordially, go back upstairs, write more vicious things about each other, and then walk home. And they were very close and had a completely diametric opposite. They're both sort of very religious in their attitude, even though they're religious in their behavior, even though their attitudes were radical. Kaplan was what's called a naturalist. He was saying, there's no such thing as a sense of the ineffable. There's what you know is what you know. The world as you see it is the world as you see it, right? If a guy stands on the corner of Ventura and Sepulveda and says, God spoke to me, you don't call him a prophet, you call him a lunatic. You call an ambulance, they give him a shot of Haldol, and he'll feel better tomorrow. How come a guy living 20 centuries ago is any less crazy? So for Kaplan, there's only, the world is sort of flattened into the world of our common experience, and he's going to try to find a rationale for the sacred within our common experience. And Schulweis was Kaplan's student, which is why Schulweis never understood Heschel until he had his 3rd heart attack. And after Schulweis's 3rd heart attack, he started reading Heschel again. And he told me, he said, I've discovered things I didn't see before. I wonder why. Because it happens. I mean, it's a different way of understanding philosophy. Okay, and we'll look at the contrasts. We'll see the contrasts. Okay, yeah, Mark. He right there on the screen. You saw him. Yeah. He would say, if Heschel were here, he'd say, how do you fix this broken world of ours? Well, first of all, he got involved. I mean, he was fighting against, he wanted America to end its involvement in Vietnam. He wanted America to take seriously its racial issues. He wanted Russia to let go of its Jews. He got the Catholic Church to change its doctrines and its prayers. He worked hard on the ground with social issues. But more than that, as a philosopher, he said, we have to change our attitude. We have to regain what he called here a sense of appreciation. We have to understand that human beings are precious no matter what they look like, no matter what their race and background is. We have to understand that the planet we live in is precious. And it's not just a factory, a set of resources, but it's nature has its own preciousness. We have to regain that sensibility, that way of walking in the world. Otherwise, we're going to destroy ourselves. And the damn thing is that 50 years later, you got to say, he might have been right. He might have been right. So let's finish with this. He had a very, very, very powerful sensitivity to language. And once he learned English, a powerful sense of English. So what I want to do is just the following. Here's the book. I want you to go get the book. I want to ask 8 questions about the title of the book. Because the title of the book is so suggestive. It's called God in Search of Man. All right, what's the first thing you notice about that? That's the wrong title. If you're writing a book about religion and how to approach religion, the book should have been called Man in Search of God. Because that's what religion is. We're all out trying to figure out, is there a God? Does God exist? What does God want of me? And Heschel says, that's the problem. You see, in the sentence, man in search of God, man is the subject, the knowing subject, and God is the object. God is what you're looking for. Passive object. But as long as you turn yourself into the subject, and God is a passive object, you're never going to find God. It don't work that way, right? Think about that in any personal relationship, right? You know your wife. But Buber pointed this out. When I'm in a personal relationship, it's not subject-object anymore. It's much more mutual, right? What does it mean to, I tell you all, I know Scott, right? I know Scott so well that if Scott comes and behaves weird, I'm going to say, you're not yourself today. Now think about that idea. What does that mean? What do I know when I say I know him? It's because we've been together long enough that I understand who and the idea here is he's going to reverse our normal thinking. The whole this is what next week's lecture is going to be about. His whole, here's a fancy word, epistemology, his way of looking at the world, is about reversing our normal way of thinking and putting God as the subject and us as the object. The idea is not to go find God. The idea is to let God find you and to think about yourself as being found by God. And that reversal of epistemology, that reversal of knowing and the knower and the known, and erasing the distance between the knower and the known, is his theological move, his philosophical move, and it's also his ethical move. Because I don't just know Scott, I love Scott, right? The reason I know him so well is because we've spent so much time together because we really enjoy being together. And that's what that's the whole way we have to think about the world differently. That's what religion does, is it switches the way we know stuff. That's what's implied in the title. That's question number one. Question number two, God in search of man? Is man lost? Well, the answer is yes. That's the problem. Man, human beings, are lost to themselves, meaning we don't know the best parts of our own, we don't know ourselves. Lost to each other, lost to this planet, and lost to God. It's not just that God is in search of man, we're in search of man. We're trying to figure out who and what we are in the world. That's the ultimate question. Why am I here? God in search of man is exactly the problem. Number three, God in search of man. Well, why would God want to search for man? Only because God cares. And Heschel, this is in our third session, Heschel's philosophy of the Bible, he's going to tell us the following. Philosophy will tell you that we can know nothing about God. God is infinite, we are finite, there's nothing we can know. The Bible comes and violates that rule and says, yes, it's true, except with one exception. There's one thing you can know about God. God cares. God cares for you. And that changes everything. And if God cares, then what's the implication of that? The implication of that is that when you care, you're God, you're godly. And what does it mean that there's a God in the universe who so cares for us, God's looking for us, right? God's looking for us. It's a beautiful Hasidic story about a little boy comes to his father who's a rabbi and says, Rabbi, Father, I saw the saddest thing. We were playing hide and go seek, and nobody came to look for me. Someone comes to look for you because they care for you. When someone stops looking for you, that's a sad... God is in search of man. There's someone who cares for you. That's the third question. And here's the fourth question. Why is God in search of man? Doesn't God know everything? Well, the answer is no. Because his idea of perfection is a perfection based on caring. See, Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, said God is perfect. God has no needs. And so therefore, what is God? God is a thought thinking itself, completely aloof. But the biblical idea of God is that God has a need. God needs human beings. Torah portion we read last week was about a God who says to Abraham, come and be my partner. God who needs human beings. A God who needs is a different sense of divine perfection. Is a human being who doesn't need anybody else more perfect than a human being who needs other people? To quote the great philosopher Barbara Streisand, people who need people are the luckiest people in the world. And a God who needs people is a higher form of perfection than a God who doesn't need people. And that's why God is in search of man. That's his theology. Fifth, God is in search of man. How would you know? How would you know? If you're lost, how do you know anyone's looking for you? And how does it change you if you do know that someone's looking for you? Right? Number six, God in search of man. Of man? Generic? God is looking for humanity? Or is God looking for Scott? Is God looking for Mark? Is God looking for Sherry? Is God looking for each of us? In other words, is the religious quest to find God, or is the religious quest to let God find you? And what would that mean? what am I up to, 7? Right? Okay, God in search of man. Can he find us? Can we get found? How do you get found? Remember playing hide and seek in summertime? We used to play giant games. You play Ollie Ollie Oxenfree and everybody comes out. How do you get found? And then once you get found, what do you do? What is it? How do you respond to the idea that a God's looking for you? Right? And then number 8, which is the most important question of all, is if you take any of this seriously, how does it change your life? How does it change your tomorrow? How does it change your attitude? How does it change your behavior? How does it change the way you live in the world? What difference would it make if you really understood that there was a God, or is a God, who is waiting for us to care along with him? That's what this book is about. So those 8 questions, that's what we're going to answer. Next week, the questions of how do you know there's a God, okay? Get the book. I'm going to Xerox it, so don't worry. I'll give you plenty of pages to read. But if you can get the book, start reading the first section. The first third is all about what does it mean to find God and have God find you, okay? Everybody good? Anybody have questions this week? Let me know. We're going to post the interview so you can watch it. Take a minute if you have. It's absolutely charming. He is so playful and so much fun. And at the end, the last question, he told the interviewer before he accepted the interview, I'll do the interview on one condition, that you let me say something to the youth of America. Mind you, this is 1972. Anybody remember 1972? Anybody remember 1972? Remember what the world was like when it was to be young in 1972? It was a crazy time. And he wants to say something to the youth of America. So if you watch it through, watch it. If you don't watch it, go to 3346. That's where his last statement, you can put it up, we can watch it together. It's an amazing statement of what he wants kids to remember. You want to do it? Can you do it? My tech.
We have just about a minute or so left. I should say at the start of this hour, before we began this hour, Dr. Heschel indicated an interest in directing a message at young people, and I don't know that I ever in the past hour gave you the chance I promised you that I would give you.
I would say to young people a number of things, and I have only 1 minute. I would say let them remember that there is a meaning beyond absurdity. Let them be sure that every little deed counts, that every word has power, and that we can do everyone our share to redeem the world, in spite of all absurdities and all the frustration, all disappointments. And above all, remember that the meaning of life is to build life as if it were a work of art. You're not a machine. When you are young, start working on this great work of art called your own existence. And the best way, one of the ways of doing it, or 2 ways of doing it, is one, remember the importance of self-discipline. Second, study the great sources of wisdom. Don't read the bestsellers. And third, remember that life is a celebration, or can be a celebration. There's much of entertainment in our life. And entertainment is destroying much of our initiative. It weakens our imagination. What's really important is life as celebration. In a very deep sense, I would say that the addiction, the drug addiction, which so many people suffer, is due to the fact that man cannot live such a shallow life, stale. He needs exaltation. He needs moments of celebration. One of the most important things is to teach men how to celebrate life.
Enjoy that, okay? Thanks so very much, everyone. Thanks so much.